Hello there. I'm Beppe once again, starting a new Araucast episode. This is episode number 4, and once again I'm here being joined by Emerald and the Hermit. Hello guys. Good evening. How are you doing?
I'm doing good, thank you. Thank you, sir. I hope you two are fine, and I hope this episode, which has a great theme, is pretty is enjoyable for our listeners.
Thanks for having me again, Beppe. I'm doing fine. I'm just enjoying my new year and happy new year to all of you and to all of you watching. Hopefully it's a great year and hopefully it's a great podcast as the previous ones have been. And let's get on it.
True. Happy New Year to you guys. Happy New Year to our audience, which seems to be small for now, but I hope it grows over time. And thanks one more time for being here with me to debate a new topic. Before I start the conversation, I just need to give a reminder, not necessarily a reminder, I'm talking about this for the first time, but I made a post on the YouTube community. I think it's the community tab, mentioning that besides YouTube, if you're watching on YouTube, my main platform of choice is Odysee, which is used to be a front end for the library platform, but now it's the main platform. And I tend to use this for just for the sake of valuing an alternative to YouTube, not being too tied to it, not being too dependent on YouTube. But if you're watching, if you don't know the platform and you want to give us a watch there and make the channel grow in this alternative platform, I would be really grateful. So that's just a heads up. Okay, let's proceed to our theme. I'm trying to shorten the introductions more and more so that we have more time to debate, to discuss the theme at hand, the the subject at hand. So okay, one of the I have two motivations actually to start this discussion, and they seem to be opposite motivations because I notice in the way this manifests in the Brazilian reality. As always, we're talking about something related to the Brazilian reality, Brazilian psyche. It manifests in opposite ways. I'm not really sure if this manifests in different kind of people or in the same of people, and it's one more case, one more instance of some bipolar disorder in Brazilians and so on. But to cut things short, almost every year here, especially in my region, my home state, there are lots of cities which have grown around immigration, late immigration. I'm not talking about the Portuguese who discovered the place and conquered the territory. I'm talking about late migrations in the 19th century from by Germans and Italians and Poles and Ukrainians and even Spanish, Japanese, and so on. Those have populated a good chunk of Brazil, but especially here in the southern region. And it's my home state, especially, is pretty well known for the German colonies. It's not the only one who served Germans, but it's pretty well known for it. There's even some kind of mystique of it being too German, but regardless. And in one of our main cities, Blumenau, uh, every year people celebrate their own version of the Oktoberfest, which is originally celebrated in Munich, in Germany, if I'm not mistaken. And it's always, at least in the latest years, it has always been the target of some controversy, right? The object of some controversy because uh, many people are upset by this, as it is some kind of LARP or people refusing to fit in the Brazilian way of doing things. Oh, you're just LARPing as Germans. You have nothing to do with this, and so on. And in the last year, this thing had been aggravated by the case of a couple from one of some other city which is pretty famous for the German colonization. who made a video talking how to create a German baby, and it caused a lot of outrage from people because for the same reason, but it was more focused, and it always that happens every year. This kind of thing happens every year in one way or another, and makes me question what exactly are people upset about, right? Because there's this idea that there's this I get this perception that we value diversity to some extent. You hear a lot about this. That Brazilians diverse, the Brazilians are diverse, and so on. But every time something appears that is really different, people refuse it. We have some kind of diversity. We value this diversity, but it's a kind of diversity that cannot be diverse. I even heard people saying that, oh, those people who celebrate Oktoberfest, they have no personality at all. Uh, in a way that, oh, actually the only way you can have a personality is by celebrating the carnival, which the entire, not necessarily the entire country, but most of the country celebrates. You only have personality when you do everything that the things that everybody else is doing, which is it makes no sense to me, and it shouldn't surprise me because things making sense here is not very common. But I was looking at it and thinking, okay, that we have some problem with this kind of we have a problem with things which are different. People talk about diversity, but at the same time, they want some homogeneous um, idea of they have some homogeneity in what a Brazilian is and cannot tolerate things that deviate from it. But at the same time, people take pride in things which are also nonsensical. Like I remember people. There's a well-known fact that a lot of criminals like have Brazilian passports because Brazil is so diverse, quote unquote, that anyone could be pretend to be a Brazilian and people won't be suspicious about it. And at the same time, they look for this homogeneity. They also celebrate this fact, this the idea that we don't have a stereotype, and for that sake and for that reason everybody can pretend to be a Brazilian. I get the impression that the same kind of people have holds both opinions. They don't want things to be too different, but at the same time they value the difference when it makes you when it allows you to incorporate anything. Sorry if I'm not being expressing myself properly, but I think you guys understand what I'm talking about. It seems that it's contradictory the way we handle the things regarding identity. At the same time, we want some homogeneity, but we also don't want to be defined by anything. We need to have being Brazilian has to be so vague to the point that anyone could be part of this group. Not sure what you guys think about it.
Well, to me, one thing is pretty clear. There is an unquestionable racial connotation to it, in the sense that whenever one tries to express one culture, it only gets real backlash if it is a white European culture. You don't see a lot of backlash, for instance, to the practice of black culture or black sovereignty or even black nationalism here, and even though these so-called African revival movements are as much artificial as are, for instance, German revival movements. They are so far removed from their country and their origin than the whites are, but only one gets the reprehension, uh, and that's of course because white people tend to be richer, tend to be more proeminent, and have the past of being the dominant power, and that of course translates into our eternal cultural kind of cultural war territory where, white men bad, European men bad, and that's where it goes. But there is also another angle where you can look at it, is that the sort of multiculturalism that Brazil promotes is not a sort of like an empire sort of stuff where you have domain over multiple nations. It instead is a kind of homogenization process where instead of trying to incorporate multiple cultures to preserve their elements, we instead try to bring down all cultures to the same levels. So the expectation is that when a foreigner comes here, he's not to preserve everything that makes him great, but instead to give up all those things to incorporate all the things that make Brazilians bad. Not that they see it as bad, but it is what makes them bad. So, for instance, uh, uh, people of you could say German ancestry have their own clothes, their own songs, their own language, their own customs, and they are expected to drop all of that. Otherwise, they are going to be seen as weird or colonizers or as LARPers or even Nazi sympathizers. If you see the level of discourse here, and they want you to get down to the level of the lowest, most culturalist Brazilian who only cares about consumption and the general popular culture.
Absolutely. I think there is this myth in a way that because Brazil is such a diverse country in terms of people who came here from, different peoples from Europe and things like that, Africa too, and indigenous people and things like that. Because of that, there is this idea that none of them is a Brazilian culture, like more important to, or above the others in any way. So what happens is that, and I saw this a lot in Brasilia. Instead of think of modeling clay, different colors if they're separated, but when you put them all together, it becomes like this amorphous, grayish blob that has no. You can't use it, right? You can't make anything with this modeling clay. But it used to be a lot of different things. So I saw this a lot in Brasilia because it's a very new city. It's, people came from different parts of the country. There is no such a thing as culture from the capital, right? And what happened is that these people become disconnected from their environment at all. I mean, completely, absolutely. And well, I there's a part of me that feels that this phenomenon is um I wouldn't say organic because of the kinds of people who came here, but it wasn't that hard to make it. And I think it's because Brazilian culture is too open for other things when they are not, European, as you were saying. There's like a hierarchy of who is the most oppressed in a way, and and these people tend to be given more importance, like you said.
It's true to some extent that things here, ethnically speaking, racially speaking, were different from other colonies or other parts of the world which are colonized. There was more, not even tolerance, when you talk about the Iberian colonies, both Portuguese and Spanish, but also some promotion of race mixing, right? When the first colonizers came here, or even not necessarily not just in America, but even in Asia, there was some the crown, the Iberian crowns were promoting it. Oh, take spouses from the native tribes and so on, so that you can uh, have better diplomatic relations with the local peoples and so on. It was a different approach. So to some extent, that's historically uh, there's a true difference. There's an actual difference between Iberian colonies and English colonies, Dutch colonies, and so on. But at the same time, there's a level idealization. Talking about the Dutch people, for instance, uh, the mark, the event that marks that represents the how can I say the foundational myth of the Brazilian people, I believe, is the Battle of Guararapes. Right? You have the Portuguese colonies, especially northeastern Brazil. We have then a lot of things happen with Dom Sebastião, which is the culprit of all problems, which is responsible for all our problems. And you get the Iberian Union, and Spain was at war with the Dutch, and the Dutch try to uh, try to extend that war to the colonies and end up conquering parts of the northeastern regions of Brazil, the ones which were responsible for producing sugarcane. And they dominate the region during some period, and then the Portuguese organize their forces in order to expel the Dutch invasion. And in one of the final battle, you have the troops, you have contingents for the Portuguese army with actual Portuguese people, Europeans, Portuguese Europeans, uh, some Native Americans, and also blacks, which were being used as slaves at the time. And you have this coalition, not necessarily voluntary, but you have this coalition of three nations, so to speak, in order to defeat the Dutch invader. And uh, that's also the beginning. That's considered the beginning of the Brazilian army uh, as well. But to some people, this represents the formation of the Brazilian people, right? Some kind of ethnogenesis. But they do not realize, okay, it was a battle. There was three nations there. There was no intermixer. Forgive my language, but it wasn't an orgy. there was no new, there was no new ethnicity stemming from that. But it represents this idea of the union of those three nations to expel the colonizer, the Dutch colonizer, which was much more uh, racially, how do I say, was much more pro segregation, right? And people take this and create this idea that, okay, Brazilians are the mixture of those three races, those three ethnicities, and they stop at that. That's the 17th century, and they cannot comprehend something deviating from this. There's late migrations. Oh, how do we fit the millions of Italian migrants that came to São Paulo? How do we fit the millions of German, Poles, Ukrainians, Japanese migrants that came to other regions of Brazil? You either pretend they do not exist, they are an exception, as I have already heard, or you just say, oh, once they came here, they almost instantly race mixed, and now they are part of the same cauldron of genetic material. So it's all the same thing. Um, and
The melting pot, right?
yeah, it's a melting pot. It's an automatic melting pot. And you stop, and you do not give any consideration to the idea there are some of those peoples who kept themselves more isolated and so on. That's not a thing. There's not a thing. And I need to touch on something that the hermit said, that it's true that through for the most part, this hostility towards differentiation falls more on white Europeans. People are much more hostile to the idea of an European community preserving their particular traditions and so on. But there's a specific case where I see hostility towards blacks as well. For instance, there are some groups, there are a few groups that talk about, okay, I want to marry men, only want black men just want to marry, only want to only wanting to marry black woman, or black woman only wanting to marry black man. And a lot of people get upset about it because they say, oh, that's not how Brazil is. We're a mixed people. That's you're we need to dedicate an episode to this idea of importing uh subjects, right? Importing debates. But to get ahead of myself, there's a yo, uh that's not characteristic of us. That's not something that we do. You should always race mix. There's this, we reject this on principle because it seems like race mixing is some kind of redeeming feature of the Brazilian civilization, right? We look at our past. Oh, we I don't know, we killed the colonizer killed many Native Americans. The colonizer brought a lot of blacks as slaves. But at least, and I've heard that as well. At least we're not racist because we have race mixed, and now there's no possibility to be racist because everybody's the same. We're not like the United States. They had they made use of they made far less use of slavery, but they are worse because they are racists. We're not like South Africa as well. We never had an apartheid regime, and the bad things that we have done, they can be uh, swept under the rug because we have done this redeeming process of mixing everybody to the point that everybody is the same thing.
Yeah, it enters on that realm that about being ashamed of your past, that kind of mythos of the shameful past, that Brazil was this big slaver hellhole, that Portuguese were some evil marauders which just went on killing Indians indiscriminately. And that of course isn't the case. But if you think that is the case, it makes total sense that uh, Portugal or maybe Brazil kind of redeemed all this process by incorporating them into their social fabric, which is a big lie. We all know it's a big lie because even after decades, centuries, and many centuries of miscegenation or mixing, race mixing, you can still clearly see differences of character, of culture, of even geographical differences between areas inhabited by certain peoples. Uh, with the natives, it is much more clear because they inhabited zones which were very unfriendly to European civilizations. So for a long time, they managed to be much more independent than the Black nation, for instance. So a tribe in the middle of the Amazon, no reasonable European will try to inhabit the middle of the Amazon. So they were brought into the fold in a much more diplomatic manner and consequently had much less contact with the rest of Brazil. And ironically, they were the best to preserve their culture, those who didn't race mix, those tribes in the middle of the Amazon. So that's a funny thing right there. They are, of course, exalted by those who celebrate our diversity. But I digress. The great thing about this discussion of race mixing and identity is basically what Emerald said. Uh, Whenever you get to this state of amorphous globosis or this amorphous glob, where you take all the cultures of the world and you reduce them to this gray goo with no shape, no culture, or no history, you just create a mass man, a nihilistic man, a man of nothing, and this kind of person is basically just becomes industrial fodder and then when you have the disruptions in the country psyche, and especially thinking the the introduction of global culture and of drugs, you just create a basically a zombie cast. And that's basically the new Brazilian identity, is the lack of true identity being substituted by these uh, poisonous foreign and psychedelic substances.
And consumerism.
Yeah.
But yes, you made a video recently in Portuguese, of course, which was very interesting, where you said that to love Brazil, you have to hate him. And I think you nail it, I mean, perfectly. There is no such a thing as pride for your own history, your own, your past, or things like that. If you are born in the northeastern region, you have to be proud of the caramel dog and of the flip flops you wear. It's very unsubstantial, right? And I mentioned Brasilia before because I think that the idea that these movements have this homogenization, it's very like turning the entire country into a big Brasilia in a way, because there's no such thing as differentiation of you know peoples or things like that in the capital. The only You mentioned the tribes in the Amazon forest that didn't get in contact with the Europeans, and they preserved themselves. Yeah, in Brasilia, the only places that I saw actual cultures were in very ethnocentric um, establishments, like a kendo temple, not a kendo temple. It was something Japanese, and I like over half of the people that I saw there in events, like where they opened themselves to uh, for other people, for uh, they made parties, not parties, but things like that, celebrations. And even then, it was like half the people were actually from Japanese descent. So yeah, but other than that, I didn't see anything like that in Brasilia. It's always something associated to consumerism. It's just, it's very shallow. And well, I you can go more philosophically into these things, but it really reminds me of The Present Age by Kierkegaard, where he says that there's no such in the modern era, there's no such thing as actual actual uh, assets, like valuable assets, things that you can really that are really important. Everything becomes transactional in a way. So yes, the only thing you can identify with is something that you can consume, because that's the ultimate value.
Here, I just wanted to uh, call back to something we have talked about. We and Beppe have had this conversation in the past, in Portuguese, of course, but one of the things which struck me when we talked at that time is that this notion of Brazil, which used to be, kind of viewed as the safe haven for a lot of cultures. For instance, a lot of European cultures which were in danger of extinctions at some times, which now have had the privilege to establish back their own countries, like Poland and Ukraine, found refuge in Brazil for a long time. Uh, but what happens is that Brazil stopped being this kind of place and became a whole other kind of ordeal. It became instead the place where all cultures go to die. And that term, that idea of Brazil is what struck me, because what I see today uh, is a people with no culture, a people with no history, which have a great heritage. All along, you see in Brazil pristine buildings, pristine colonial buildings, circled by a sea of favela and of concrete buildings, and all you see is this great empire in decay, surrounded by industrial waste. It is kind of like we are living in the ruins of the Roman Empire, but instead we are living in the ruins of our own civilizations. And we are seeing that in our lifetimes. And most people, I think, don't realize that. Most people are too busy being tourists in their own countries. They go around to these big palaces and they take photos, and they probably don't think about how in probably 1 or 2 generations that building is gonna fall into disrepair. Nobody's gonna care about it anymore, and it's just going to be substituted by like a mall or something.
As you guys have noticed in the audience, we reference a lot of past conversations, and one of the main purposes of the Araucadian resistance, and particularly of the Araucast, is actually to bring those ideas we have debated in Portuguese to a broader audience, because I found them really interesting. I have this, I I get really anxious about talking about certain stuff that either interests me or upsets me, usually both, and talk about them to other people. I, I'm I end up I'm lucky to find uh, fellow Brazilians like Emerald and Hermit that which can debate about it. But at the same time, I feel I need to talk about it to more and more people as well. I need to expand it to a broader audience. People ask me, "Oh, you're starting a podcast in English because you want to reach the Anglo audience, not just the Anglo audience, but the the biggest audience possible." Because let's be honest, let's be real here. English is kind of a lingua franca nowadays. It has been for a long time, so we make this effort in order to reach more people. But going back to the subject, you guys mentioned the Native Americans, how they can still be identified, right? To this day, in the Amazon, mainly you have the Ribeirinha communities, right? I remember going on I made a boat travel in the Amazon River during 5 days, and it was really striking how you can find many of those communities in the river margin. And the only thing which differentiates them from the stereotype of a Native American from Brazil is that they were using more European clothes, quote unquote, simple clothes, but they were not naked, right? But in their appearance, in their physiognomy, they were pretty Native American. So we still have those pockets of not very mixed people of Native American ascent. Um, more stuff that I wanted wish to talk about. You can see there is a progression, right, in this idea of ethnicity and identity in Brazil. There was a time where you used to be an empire, right, an actual empire. You have a ruling, not only a ruling class, but a ruling nation, a ruling ethnicity, which were more tied to the Portuguese, right, more purer Portuguese people ruling over mestizos, different kinds of mestizos, and eventually late migrants, right? These people coming from other European countries or even Japan, and later from the Middle East, right? From the Levant, a lot of Lebanese, Syrians, Turks, quote unquote, which are not a very precise term at the time, and they were part of society, right? But they are seen as different groups at the same time, at, during in a certain time, subject to this uh, almost Portuguese elite. Then you have the evolution just to this elevation of the pardo, so to speak, right? The mulatto, the caboclo, the cafuso,
The
which are
mutt.
yeah the different kinds of race mixed people, but you still have this idea of an identity. Okay, the Brazilian identity is the brown, quote unquote. The Brazilian identity is this guy who is the mixture of those, especially those three primary races, right? The Iberian Portuguese, the Black African, and the Native American. But now you have this final stage where even this is being dropped, in favor of, as you guys commented, the idea of, oh, no identity at all. We're anything. We're not only we don't have an identity, we remove the identity of anyone who comes here, right? Drop your cultural and ethnic veneer and adhere to anything that would make you Brazilian, which is actually nothing, which is actually some platitudes. Oh, you use short clothes because here, everywhere is hot. You like samba. You like sitting at a plastic table in the front of a bar and drink beer. It's pretty superficial, and somehow that's the way you have a personality. If you want to have anything other than that, you're LARPing. Okay. Well, you want to preserve or you want to cultivate different uh, different practices other than that, you're just LARPing. You're just a traitor to your country. You're just paying homage to colonizers and so on. This is you can see the things are getting progressively worse, and it's super sad, right? Because when you think about the world as a macrocosmos, one of the beauties of the world is, okay, every place has its own traditions, its own way of doing things. It's cool to think about the stereotype of a, not necessarily a German, but a Bavarian, the stereotype of an Englishman, the stereotype of an Egyptian, the stereotype of an Australian, a Chinese, a Japanese. This is something beautiful of all the world. You can see everybody having its own way of life, and the same way that this is being dissolved in the world nowadays. You look at Brazil, you see as the advanced state of this process, right? People don't care at all. Most people don't care at all about being different in a substantial way. They want to be different individually to some extent, but this differentiation is basically doing what everybody else is doing. It's a total contradiction.
Yeah. The thing is, Brazilians are not only not interested in identity, they are actively hostile to it. So any attempt to try to classify one's ancestry in a certain way will lead to a certain level of hostility. Of, oh no, you're trying to sound better than us just because you have this and this ancestry, or you have European blood or Asiatic blood or whatever. Uh, there is a level not only of passive rejection but active resistance. Uh, uh, the the great thing about early Brazil was, as you mentioned, this idea of the empire, which, of course, the main idea of the empire is the core periphery relation. And we think of this a lot in terms of mainly political, geographical, and military terms. But uh, maybe it's not that comfortable for 21st century people to think about empires in terms of racial and cultural relations. As Beppe brilliantly put, the empire of Brazil was founded on this idea of the Portuguese European whites ruling over a vast quantity of subjects, of diverse subjects. And this is not something out of the world. And Portugal didn't come here unprepared for this. Portugal actually spent centuries ruling over Moorish populations, Jewish populations. They actually had started trading in Africa and in Asia before they came here. So Portugal had already become an empire. It already started to rule multiple people. So before they even came to Brazil, they already had that notion of the empire. But Beppe pointed out this, but as Brazilian colonization developed, this idea of the empire was very well maintained up until independence. The empire of Brazil was much more progressive than the old Kingdom of Portugal, which, of course, the Kingdom of Portugal would later become more progressive than Brazil after independence. Both were going to go off on a very liberal tangent after it. But the Empire of Brazil was relatively progressive for the time, even though you could say, "Whoa, but it practiced slavery." What do you mean? Well, the slave trade was abolished pretty quickly. You only had legacy slavery for a long time. Uh, the Brazilian crown and the Brazilian monarchy was actually very sympathetic to to black people and to mixed people, and these people actually love the monarchy, even to the point that one of the biggest uh, uh, nationalistic parties, or you can, depending on how you see it, a sort of fascistic or proto-fascistic movement, the Ação Patronovista, was led by a black guy. So uh, there was, of course, not this idea of the great multi-ethnic empire. It was still on the mind of these people, the idea of different nations, but that kind of relation of the core Brazilian identity being the white European Portuguese expanded to these three. So the mulattoes were kind of elevated as co-equals to the European whites in the ruling of Brazil, and you saw this very clearly during the Vargas regime, where European whites and specifically European Portuguese whites and Portuguese native slash blacks mixed people were kind of the center, the the kind of imperial racial center, and they were to dominate all the other cultures, including other white cultures. So when the Germans, Italians, and Japanese came to Brazil, and especially during World War II, they were heavily repressed by the Vargas regime because they were seen as the periphery. Uh, Eventually, that kind of faded out, and you moved on to this more uh, universalist view, which kind of gave up on the whole, this group is going to try to rule, the others is going to obey or are going to follow or are going to grow besides. And eventually, excuse me, and eventually you move on to this sort of universalist egalitarian view of race relations, where no race can be above one another in a cultural sense. So you gradually begin to see the mutual and general degradation of all cultures and races in the country.
Well, people used to think Brazilians, right, in the 19th century, late 19th century, when slavery was about to be abolished. Yes, they used to think about races, but it wasn't like the defining group that people used to define themselves, right? So you can see these racial relations in literature from the time. My personal favorite is Esau and Jacob, where you see that people didn't even care about the republic or the monarchy. They just wanted to, go on with their lives the best way possible. But Lima Barreto has that. Olavo really liked this book. Um, his most famous one, I forgot the title. Uh, O Triste Fim de Policarpo Quaresma, The Sad Ending of Policarpo Quaresma. And the main character is trying to find this Brazilian identity because he wants to be a nationalist, but he doesn't know how to be a nationalist because he can't define this Brazilian identity. Every time he tries to do it, he finds it's either not really Brazilian, like it's from some tribe that isn't actually in the geographic territory of the country, or it's just something artificial that was made up to sell like circus tickets or whatever. So it's a very it's a difficult debate. Of course, there is such a thing as different Brazilian traditions, right? Different ones, multiple. But the idea of unifying this is kind of. I think nowadays it gets to a point where I wouldn't say Brazilians are just hostile to identity, as Hermit said, but they are hostile to individuality in general. They're I don't want to bring this up again, but Kierkegaard defines in the present age a concept of leveling, where it's basically um, where people suppress their own individuality because they don't want to leave the mess. It's kind of like that. So the opposite would be like I think he says a volcanic explosion where a person uh, is just so they can't stop hearing their own minds, while leveling is the opposite. It's like you you get so still, you stay still so much that it becomes deadly. You just accept your environment to the last bitter end. And I think the modern Brazilians are in the second category. They're not only hostile to identity, they're hostile to individual identity. They're hostile to, you know, I think it's way deeper, the problem.
And trying to tie what both of you guys have said, the same way our character Policarpo had trouble finding an organic Brazilian identity and found out that everything ended up being artificial. That shows us a lot what happened during the Vargas regime, right? As the hermit mentioned, there was the repression, the cultural repression of many late migrants, mainly Italians, Germans, and Japanese, because of their potential ties to the Axis powers, and that involved a prohibition of talking their native languages, and that had some um, permanent consequences for the propagation of their cultural heritage. Right, people weren't able to preserve the language as well as before. You see some there is some revival later, but there's always a that was has been harmed permanently. But and look, I'm going on a tangent here. I am of Italian ascent. I have a particular problem with this repression, but at the same time, I wouldn't find it uh, problematic if the Brazilian government have demanded the migrants learn Portuguese, for instance. Okay, you're in Brazil, you need to work inside the institutions, you need to learn Portuguese. That's not an issue at all. But when you forbid people from keeping what they brought to Brazil, their own mainly language, but other traditions as well, you're stripping them from some valuable cultural assets. Imagine if that didn't happen, and you have a much bigger population in Brazil able to. You wouldn't speak formal German, formal Italian, formal Japanese, but you would have much more aptitude for learning those languages in order to be a translator, in order to be a diplomat, and so on. And you threw it all away. Not at all, but you threw a lot of this away just because of fear of some. I don't. I'm not sure if it was because of fear, because Vargas was pretty ambiguous, ambivalent towards the Axis and Axis powers and the Allies, right? He basically blackmailed FDR to join the Allies by demanding material for creating our first uh, steelworks, right? And other things as well. So it's not that I don't think he was really afraid of German culture, Italian culture, and Japanese culture in themselves, but he just wanted to force this homogenization process. And what else I was going to say?
I was just gonna, sorry to interrupt you. I was just gonna say really quickly that I think the reason why Vargas did it is because he probably viewed people much more like an economic asset than people in themselves. Because his whole platform was kind of based on economic theory or and economic growth. The kind of Brazilian identity question was kind of secondary to his more political and economic aims. So this idea of bringing all the immigrants of the world, but forcing them to abandon their roots, is this attempt to try to create a kind of universal Brazilian working class. Because we have to remember when Vargas tried to industrialize Brazil, it was still a largely agrarian country, and by removing the rights of these people to speak their languages, especially on those closely tied ethnic enclaves, you kind of make them semi unfunctional, and you lead a lot of people to the cities to work on the factories. So that's I think one of the biggest incentives there.
True. Yeah, his regime was a pretty big transition. For people who don't know the history, he his term, his regime basically ended what is known as the Old Republic, which is more marked by local oligarchies, right? We call about the coffee and milk republic, right? Because normally you have an alternation between presidents who were from São Paulo, which is known for producing coffee, which were known for producing coffee at the time, and from Minas Gerais, which was very strong on the cattle herding and milk production, right? And he emerged from the Federalist Revolution, and also the tenantist movement, if I'm not mistaken, which had a different which had different intentions, different views for the future of Brazil. So he represents a pretty substantial uh, rupture with this oligarchical model, which is inheriting a lot from the imperial times.
And also Castelism, right?
True.
Uh, um, uh, if I may add something to what you said, Hermit, I think this modern lack of identity is closely related to this view that Vargas had of people as um, economic assets, right? This mass culture, the thing that I said, the caramel dog, flip flop bullshit. It's a perfect playground for politics as seeing people not as individuals but as economic assets, which is the progressive view, like the old progressive view. I mean, it's not that different from the modern progressive view. And by progressive, I mean American progressive, like progressivism, like Richard, Eli, and these guys. So in a way, Brazil and progressivism are kind of made to one another because we have pretty much, as I said, always been hostile to this individuality. You just have to add the the idea of managing society.
To some extent, Getúlio Vargas is our FDR, right?
Exactly. That's where I was getting at.
Well,
Perfect.
you guys don't have to look far to see Brazil's link to progressivism. It's right there on the flag.
Well,
uh,
it's kind of different. That's more positivism, right?
yeah, yeah. I'm just playing with you guys,
But
but
but but yeah, it's similar in that sense because they were scientific, right?
yeah.
Yeah, it's a great point.
Uh,
Positivism in itself is a rabbit hole that yeah, it's
I,
French too, so I'm prejudiced against it.
I was just gonna say that what Emerald mentioned about Brazilian culture is that this kind of commercialized and mass culture is an attempt or is a kind of simulation of culture. It's a what we could call a simulacra of culture. So we're kind of living in this shadow realm where culture doesn't matter, but you have to at least simulate a little bit of culture, as artificial as it is, just to keep the whole machine going, because it would probably go nuts, as it is already going nuts without culture. So all this uh, pseudo Brazilian culture of flip flops, of carnival, of funk, of the beaches of Rio, of you know the great Brazilian influencers or whatever bad music people listen to nowadays. It's all of kind of simulation to try to keep it all together, but it's kind of like trying to wrap a ball with wool linings. It's not gonna hold on for much longer, I feel.
That's true. And even aspects of this apparent, this artificial Brazilian culture, which seem to be organic, which seem to be more historical, they have been heavily modified. When you look at the carnival, for instance, we had street carnival in Brazil since forever. It was a tradition in many places, but what the Vargas regime, our main villain here, apparently have done was creating this different kind of carnival which looks like a military parade, right? We have the Sapucaí way where there was the parade of the many samba schools, quote unquote. That's how they're called. Not sure if there's a better translation. We have and it's very organized. Oh, you have the allegorical cars. Here you have this particular kind of performer and so on. So it actually is pretty entertaining to see when I was a kid, but at the same time, it's an artificial form of the tradition which was progressively replacing the actual stuff.
Yeah, and I think it was purposely made for trying to industrialize the country. And when you take people away from their roots, from their country roots, which are more directly tied to heritage and to lineage, you have to kind of create this simulacra of culture from the industrial worker. And that's that kind of mass produced culture that Brazilians have accustomed to consume.
Okay, I love this topic. I love this topic because one of my favorite Brazilian artists is a samba guy from the 20s, Noel Rosa. And you can see the difference between the samba marches, how they're called, that used to be played on the carnival, and from the 20s, and the difference to the 50s or something. You see that the nationalistic, the very artificially nationalistic uh, sayings or lyrics only began way after the 20s. If you take Noel Rosa's lyrics, they're all very irreverent. He's kind of a malandro, like an actual malandro. I don't know how to translate that, but it's like
Vagabond wouldn't be the best.
Kind of like sleazy.
yeah, yeah, something like these two words together. So he's irreverent. He's not, you know, um, he's not mean spirited, but he's also not exactly a good guy. So when you compare that to the more politicized or the more, uh, politicized in this nationalistic way, you see that something really weird happened. And what happened was that Vargas actually made it a policy to change the culture, to make it, he created Voz do Brasil, Brazil Voice, which was a radio show, right? It still exists, by the way.
It runs to this day.
Exactly. And you can see clearly that this identity is not something organic. It's a political project, but it's very hard to explain this to people.
And one thing that I was thinking about that I forgot before, um, this this kind of homogenization, this bottom leveling of all different cultures and ethnicities in Brazil, it naturally ends up being asymmetrical, right? Because I think I have mentioned this in a form in another episode, or maybe I only talk about this in Portuguese. But one of the tragedies of a good chunk of the Brazilian population is the fact that they didn't have too much opportunity to know their roots. When you look at the, I don't know, the descendants of the slaves, most of them have been mixed during the slave traffic, and intentionally, so that you prevent rebellions and so on. So in one or two generations, people don't even know where they have come from, and that ends up propagating, because it's a reality that you end up having uh, slave owners ended up having bastard sons and so on, which are not have not been recognized, and you propagate this you have this legacy of people who do not have proper information about their origins and so on. But then you compare it to different populations, as I have mentioned uh, in other conversations. uh, Here, close to here, we have a city we have with it hasn't been founded by Austrians, but the city developed with the creation of an Austrian colony. Not sure, probably it's the only Austrian colony in Brazil, but or at least is the first. And in the central square of the city, you have a lot of uh, how do you call this in English? You have a monument with the names of all the people who came here, listing not on their names, but the boat where they came to Brazil. You have many boats who made the travel from Europe to Brazil, and you have the description. Oh, this person was in this boat, and you have a complete list of this, and many people in the city, in other cities as well, have the complete family tree listing all of their ancestors. They have a pretty good knowledge of uh, 3, 4, 5 generations before them. There's a great discrepancy between this kind of migrant, this kind of more voluntary migrant, even though most of them were running from famine and war and so on, but it was a more conscious process comparing to slaves, or even Native Americans, which have been whose tribes have been destroyed and so on. So when you do this bottom leveling, what you do, you're basically doing that process. Oh, if I can't have this, it's not necessarily conscious, but it it's similar to the idea. If you can't have, you can't have it as well. And when you level those people, you end up throwing away a lot what some of them have more than the others, right? It's a pretty tragic process when you think about it. There are communities which are still hold those this information, as I have mentioned, but that's an exception. And you end up in the aggregate, you're diminishing, you're reducing the even the historic consciousness of the people, right?
Yeah, that's the great tragedy of equality, because it doesn't affect everyone equally. Ironically enough, right? Uh, the same goes for economic inequality, and the same goes for cultural inequalities. Some cultures are more developed, or at least, if you don't want to give that assumption, at least some cultures are more culturally aware, or have developed their expressions of it a little more than others. So inevitably, when these people who have no next to no culture see this other group of people which have had for many generations a stable heritage and something to look back to, when they are brought down to the same level, one is going to lose a lot more than the other. And that's the great tragedy of equality, both on a cultural level as well as at an economic level, which for a lot of people is easy to see when you know, when you put a percentage tax on incomes, you know that the rich is gonna pay more than the poor. But when you do this in a kind of subtle cultural way. You don't see it a lot. You don't see how you know, for instance, Europeans are going to lose a lot more heritage in this process of homogenation than African Brazilians or native Brazilians.
And that's one of the fundamental problems what I would identify as the left-wing worldview. If you don't want to use right and left because you think that's too tied to to politics, you can say about you can talk about a unrestricted worldview. I think that's what the term that Thomas Sowell uses. Uh, that when you do this kind of equalization, you're not being unfair. You're just correcting some previous artificial discrepancy, right? But it's obvious to us that this is how damaging it is that you're removing important thing from people that's a tragedy of equality. But for people who have an unrestricted view of human nature, think that everybody's a blank slate and their actual conditions, if they're different, they're result of I don't know, different privileges and so on. They're just doing some rightful. They're just uh, promoting justice, and that's the root of the perpetual disagreements, if I can say so. More than disagreements, the perpetual conflict between those two worldviews. And in the same way that this equalization process is asymmetric, the rebounds is as well. I think there was as you have touched this point already, Hermit, that this cannot go on forever. At some point, this attempt to homogenize will backfire. People will get conscious that there's something wrong. Maybe they will go after some kind of identity or individualization and so on. And that's already happening. I see the cracks appearing already. There was I think it went viral, the scene of a woman, apparently apparently white woman, in one of those samba schools that I have mentioned, because they create the parades, the carnival parades, but at the same time during the whole year they have events and so on, as far as I know. So she was at one of those samba schools, dancing and so on, uh, I don't know, enjoying herself, and there were two black women that were looking at her in a pretty disapproving way, even pointing at her and maybe saying something like, what does she think she's doing? That's not her place. And uh, there was a pretty insightful comment that mentioning one of the white woman doesn't know she's not welcome anymore. Maybe in some years prior that was pretty natural for people from different ethnicities to share that space, but as different groups are getting more conscious of their identity, they start to reject other groups as well. And the white woman was not aware of this process yet, and the other two black women were already uh, noticing it and rejecting it. And this rebounds, it is asymmetrical, not only because some groups are more have always been more allowed to identify themselves, but there is also a certain fear from the other groups to do the same because they are afraid to be tied to certain bad ideas and so on. We're talking about race mixing and the even black groups who advocate for more purity, quote unquote. There's always that kind of comment that I see among, not necessarily not only among Brazilians, but especially among Brazilians. They say, "Oh, that's what the evil mustache man would want." Like that's ends the discussion forever, right? Well, the evil mustache man would want all of us to be vegetarians. So why does that matter, right? It is automatically wrong because of that. But regardless, there's also this asymmetry in the way things are backfiring. We're equalizing unequally, and we're also and we're also reverting equalization in an unequal manner. So, and it seems like a certain side is losing on every one of those processes.
The place I see this the most is with so-called favela culture, which kind of took Brazil by storm during the last 40 years, but especially during the last 20 years. This kind of favela culture basically took over most of mainstream media, music, fashion, and entertainment and whatever have you. And and it's getting to the point where it's becoming increasingly clear that the people who were brought up on this kind of culture and which indulge on it daily are becoming a separate kind of people. And we see it quite clearly because it's a very hateful and a very, to put it in blunt words, disgusting and repulsive culture, especially to more civilized peoples. So encountering this kind of new culture has kind of awakened people to this idea that uh, people are not going to stay the same. Brazilians are not going to stay the same homogeneous blob of gray Brazilian industrial workers forever. They are changing, and a lot of them are changing for the worst. And if you don't want the worst to happen to you or to your family, you better start searching for what makes you. What are you, and who were your ancestors and your heritage? So that's why I see, or at least I think it's probable that we are going to see a resurgence in identity or a kind of introspection because we are seeing the birth of new Brazilian, or you can call it Brazilians, or kind of hostile cultures developing in our soil and parallel to us and very close to us, to people we know. And this, I think, it's going to cause a great awakening in people.
I know someone in real life, like a normie, who said that they wouldn't mind if there were a thing such as, the wall, like the one Trump promised in his first presidency. This person wouldn't mind it against Maranhenses here in Goiânia. This person is kind of a normie, by the way. So I absolutely agree with you. But I have something else to mention because you said that this aesthetics of favela, but I don't think this was. It's like it spread from the favelas because this favela aesthetic, I don't think it is actual from there. If you take a look at the people from the favelas from 40 years ago or something, I remember there was a video that went viral on X a while back, and it was a documentary or something about the favelas. And these people were very poor. They were, they were poor, but they weren't dumb. They could express themselves pretty well. They had their prejudices against pretty much everyone, including themselves.
It's a shocking video.
You know which one I'm talking about, right?
I know it. I know it. It's shocking. They seem from
Yes,
a different world.
Yeah, I know it as
exactly.
well.
Yeah, these people weren't educated, but they weren't whatever the modern stereotype of the favelado, whatever it is right now. So I mean, it might have something to do with the conspiracy theory that the government works with the narco traffic, but it's just a conspiracy. But I don't buy it that it's like a favela culture in itself. It's just the aesthetics. There's no substance.
Maybe it's just is mostly also a result from the education system as well, because those people in the video, they are more articulate than many higher class youngsters that I
From
see nowadays.
nowadays.
Yeah, from nowadays. There are many people, even which supposedly have a good education, that cannot express themselves that that well. There's something. Maybe it's a general process in education. We can bring here the thesis from at again Olavo de Carvalho. He has the Collective Imbecile series of books. He's basically saying about this process of uh, at first intentional degeneration of the education process, but at some point the thing gets live, gets his own live, and starts degrading itself, starts being degraded by itself. It's the snowball, right? The snowball effect. So you have progressively worse teachers teaching progressively worse students, and things go on and on.
Absolutely. And when you think about it, the progressives in America, they were what? They were mostly bureaucrats with regards to education. Woodrow Wilson was the only, to this day, the only American president who has a PhD. And what was he? A professor. Like, I don't think, when I said that Brazilians are the Brazilian culture is kind of the perfect playground for progressivism. This is what I mean. I, it's it's in practice what they wanted to do. It goes back even to what we said in the previous episode. In a way, the Workers' Party is kind of the most American thing ever.
True. You'll see even foreign commentators looking at Brazil uh, in those about the looking at those aspects that we're commenting here, and looking at it as some kind of window to the future. We talk a lot about the Brazilification of the word, right? A lot of things are happening in other countries that seem pretty familiar to us, and the same way that we can see Brazil as this window for the, I don't know, uh, miscegenation and this progressive dumbification of people, we can see also a little bit ahead. We can also see ahead and the consequence of those, the rebound of this backfiring, because there's this from many groups. There is this belief that, oh, we can, the same belief that Brazilians had for a long time. Well, we can end racism if we make this big orgy, this big demographic orgy, and everybody being kind of the same. But they end up missing two things. That mixing is never uniform, right? There was a recent article mapping the different ethnicities you have had in Brazil, and they ended up identifying thousands of different genetic groups. And the dumbed down version of this article, which ended up in some magazines and so on, the commentators are taking, was basically saying, "Oh, look, we're all race mixed, therefore we're all the same," and they were not looking at the academic article saying, "Oh no, there's also those thousands of different groups." So you can never really homogenize people this uniformly. And the other problem is the the human the human species and the human brain has this many times useful but at times inconvenient tendency of looking at patterns. So even though if you, at the first you have this uniform mass of people, over time people will find differences and form different groups. You never solve this problem. You can look at, it doesn't matter how you try to homogenize by excluding or by mixing, you always end up with different groups. You can look at Yugoslavia, which is more genetically homogeneous, and people ended up hating themselves anyways. If you look at places where people try, there's more race mixing, you have different groups anyway. So you always find patterns, you always aggregate people around in certain groups, and you never solve this. So this Brazilification of the world you see in some places, and with a certain hope of more racial, of more racial harmony, with more ethnical harmony, we can see here in Brazil that how this can backfire as well, right? We have this privilege and curse of being this window to the future, which can be used by foreign analysts to predict what will happen somewhere else.
Dude, there's a great example of that. Germany. Take a look at East Germany and West Germany. They're the same people, but they're genetically they're the same people, but they're not the same people.
They're not at
In
all.
every single map, you color right. You whatever the metric is, East East Germany is always one color, and West Germany is always another color. Always.
You can't stop a chud from noticing. Noticing is an inherent
Exactly.
human ability, and the Brazilification of the world is one of my big chicks. Uh, and the thing is, the periphery reveals the future. So a lot of people are trying to predict the future of America, the future of Europe. If they don't change their cars, their future is Brazil. Of course, you don't see a lot of race mixing in this great migration waves which we are seeing, but in cities which have this tradition of singing it, like LA, like Miami, and probably some other American cities, and probably some European cities, you see the same process that have taken place here, and through no coincidence at all, since they are all linked in some way. In LA, you have the same kind of drug cartel problems you have in Brazil, in Miami more so. So it is a pattern, and you can't not notice it because you can't stop a child from noticing. So when I talk about the favela culture, uh, I know, I am aware that when the favelas originated, most of the people there were, well adjusted, normal Brazilians, working class, sure, but they were no normal Brazilians. The thing is that it metastasized, like all cultures do under certain circumstances, into something inherently different. So when you take a culture and you stress it with enough endogenous shocks, it becomes something different. So the favela culture was this kind of insular areas inside cities which were bombarded by American media and consumerism with heavy miscegenation and urban decay, and especially drug trafficking and the effect it had on families, on security, on relations, and that this was all transformed through heavy use of media into its own culture, its own kind of cultural power. So you see it all over the world. If you look at, for instance, in France, the kind of migrant youth behaves a lot like a favelado. It behaves like this kind of parallel culture which exalts crime and which largely follows the same demographic. So this kind of idea that the future reveals itself on the periphery, where people can experiment more, or where these endogenous shocks happen in places where there is not that great binding agent or that great stabilizing force of a strong central government. It's what allows this kind of breeding grounds, to this kind of looking glass, to see how these experiments turns out.
Yeah, and as you said, this idea of how do I say, looking for harmony, this forceful harmonization of different peoples, it never creates a perfect mixture of then. They create those things create new groups, which just add to the confusion. You always create something new. You're not just re- reaching the harmony between the groups you had before.
Yeah, that's something we mentioned on our talk in Portuguese about this subject, that race mixing is not an agent of homogenization as it is a weapon of complexity. And the more complex this kind of web of relations you get, the more people have to turn to these other kinds of identity. Uh, so that's why a lot of people identify with what we said, these kind of artificial cultures, be it the state sanctioned your state sanctioned carnival or your state sanctioned favela advert. Uh, I have discussed in my channel previously the fact that Brazilian propaganda has shifted from this kind of, Bossa Nova, Vargas era, military regime era, Brazilian good living and this exaltation of Rio and Copacabana, to this new exaltation of Brazilian low life, especially in poor communities, as the new representation of Brazil. And that is deliberate because by the way that they did it in the past, they formed the culture, the artificial culture that we experience today. And there is now another attempt to try to create another artificial culture. So whenever you have this confusion by way of falsely claiming to have integrated everyone, you have to again follow it up with an artificial stuff, because people are not going to cling to this mess or this unexistence of heritage.
I'm getting a bit ahead of myself because I plan to do an episode only for that, but th- that that has to do some of the fundamental aspects of third worldism. Is the exaltation of the lower aspects of your society, the exaltation of vulgarity. Uh, actually, you take you see this thing that people rejected for so long, this life in the favelas, this life at these slums with no proper hygiene, or at least sanitation structure and so on, no urbanism and all that. Actually, that's a good thing. You only rejected this because we are too influenced by this first world cultural colonization, but that's actually a good thing. You need to promote this. So, and in this process, you keep yourself in that process. Society as a whole keep itself in a less developed state because they keep promoting the things that don't allow them to progress.
What I think happens too is that we have talked about these artificial cultures, uh, and by their nature being artificial, they are eventually find out that they are artificial. So I know that in our generation we have had a lot of cultural shock at realizing that this idyllic notion of old Rio, old Copacabana, this kind of post post World War II Brazilian consensus was kind of a lie, was ripe with corruption, and it wasn't that successful, etc., etc. People eventually started to noticing uh, this was a lot more criticized by the left, which saw it as a pseudo-fascistic. The uh, you know After the 1988 remote redemocratization of Brazil, everything associated with the past went to this kind of basket of the shameful past, and we had, to realize or come to terms that the whole culture before 1988 was artificial, was created by generals or fascists or whatever have you. And so they eventually began to peel back these layers, but the necessity of a culture still stood to create this artificial culture. And that is the process that has been going on up to this day. And eventually, this artificial culture is going to break down with another shock event, whatever it may lie on the future. But people are again going to have to be asked the same question: do they want another artificial culture, or are they going to return to a more, blood and soil kind of stuff, a more rooted idea? That is, I think, the big question. Because by the way we are going right now, we're just jumping from artificial culture to artificial culture.
Right. Yeah, the left is almost always end up criticizing stuff for the wrong reasons. If they even when they are worth criticizing, this idea of the idyllic Rio, the Copacabana, the beaches, and so on. To be honest, maybe I'm being too provincial here. Is that the proper word? But those things never said anything to me. I don't. It's not familiar to me because you see, it's one city in a country in the size of a continent, right? There are many people who do not identify with this. So you could criticize it the proper way, in my view, by saying, oh, that's not representative of most people in the country. Even though Rio has a large population, it's not even 10% of the entire population. So it's not representative of many people. People want to feel more, to see something that is more related to them. But when the left, which has it's so culturally hegemonic, looked at this, oh, they criticize only from the point of view of, as you say, some fascistic vibes and so on. So, oh, let's just replace this uh, nationally imposed culture by something else, which seems more inclusive to us. But it's not inclusive. It just represents a tiny fraction of a single city, and everybody else has to pretend they identify with this. Yeah, there's also a phenomenon that runs in parallel to this that I still couldn't figure it out, which is the phenomenon of the Brazilian country music, because it is artificial to some extent as well. The same way that happens with Carnival, that you have this state sanctioning form of something that which was actually traditional at some point. You have the Brazilian country music as a commercialization of some hinterland culture as well, the sertanejo culture. But I cannot understand properly what happened there because it doesn't seem to be uh, government promoted. It has to do more of the formation of the agricultural elite, which is detached from the cities elite in Brazil, right? There's this process. Oh, we have this agricultural elite, which is more Americanized, and you have the city, the leftist elite, which is more Gallicized, have more French influences. And I don't quite understand what's the process through which we have the creation of this Brazilian country movement, which is also artificial to some extent, but uh, it gives more representation to a certain chunk of the population.
I mean, I think you're kind of spot on your analysis. I think the phenomena of country music can be successfully explained by American influence through and through. Of course, the core of it is a kind of a pan-European kind of stuff, popular music, and in the Brazilian context in specifics, it is the kind of Iberian Portuguese instruments which dominate. the kind of themes and etc. But the move from this deeply rooted folkloric music or folk music, to use a better term, to a kind of commercialized and and being blunt Americanized version is exactly because of American influence in the sense that you had this big opening of Brazil to foreign ideas, you, clothes. Our guys, our country guys, they wear jeans and Texas hats the same way a Texan would, which is completely removed from the Brazilian context. But America, being this big cultural hegemon, has cultural influence. So have created this kind of artificial country culture in parallel to the old legitimate folk culture of Brazil, and I think that basically explains it all. I don't think there's a great mystery there.
The thing that I wonder about is it seemed to have been a more privatized process, right? Because that's not something promoted institutionally. Because the city elites, the more academic elites, they despise that kind of culture. So it seems to have developed in parallel.
I think the American influence is a little underrated culturally because even when people hate, quote unquote, hate, they say they hate America. They're very Americanized. We talked about this the other day, but it's very hard to hate America. It's very hard when you take so much from it. All the pop singers are Americanized. All the country singers are Americanized. There's no way around it. And this is a topic that I think I would disagree with both of you a lot, but I would prepare myself if we were to talk about it. Um, but I think that one of the strongest weapons that America has is just um, this kind of free culture that people like to have fun, and in many ways, uh, it has liberated the world. I mean, um, I've I'm not sure if it's true, but I've heard that even in places like North Korea, there's things being trafficked in things. I mean, American related to American culture, like music or you know uh, jeans. You mentioned jeans. Jeans in Eastern Europe were something people wanted at the time. Václav Havel, the Czechoslovakian guy who liberated them from communism, he was a Frank Zappa fan. He sold counterfeit Frank Zappa albums, and he almost made Frank Zappa actually a Secretary of Commerce or something. So yeah, I think American culture is very powerful, and I don't think it's going to change anytime soon. In the same way that it goes for progressivism, it can go in the way of these new um, dissident phenomena that we talked about in the first episode.
Yeah, I agree that the our city elites are also Americanized, but it is from a different kind of America. When it's talk about it, oh, the city elites, they mirror themselves more on the American cities. They're looking at New York, they're looking at San Francisco, Los Angeles, and so on. And the Brazilian country, they're looking more at the red states, right? So there are different kinds of America they are modeling themselves after. And even there in America, one of those hates the other, right? To some extent.
Yes, but still, like when I say American culture, of course there are many different kinds of American cultures, right? But it's still, uh, I don't think it would be possible with many other countries. I'll put it that way.
Uh, what I think happens is that American influence kind of functions as a separate institution which doesn't work with, but works against, or better in competition with the government sponsored agenda. So during mainly the 1980s and 1990s, you had this big shift in Brazil of Americanization. We had a lot going before, during, like, especially after 1964, which was when we formally declared allegiance to America in the Cold War by doing the coup against communism and stuff. But after 1980 and 19 in the 90s, which were the years of the great commercial opening, you had the flooding the gates with American products and influence, and they work in an extent that they compete with the local cultures, and they don't necessarily work along with them. So when there is this idea that the city elites propagated one culture and that the rural elites propagated another, is that American influence in some places had a deeper reach than the government itself, especially because the government was selling something to these people which they had no interest in or didn't see themselves reflected. So when they came in with a much more, friendly and closer culture to them, which, the American cowboy and the Brazilian frontiersman are kind of similar in some ways. Of course, there's a big cultural and a big heritage difference there, but they like the same things, they live in the same environments, and there's a lot of cultural exchange to be had there. Some exchange that the Brazilian government was not that keen on, and is still not keen on recognizing the great Brazilian heritage. So it is only natural that whenever that power comes, it takes hold. It's that thing that Yarvin talks about in leaking power. Brazilian culture leaks a lot because our institutions don't want to recognize uh, a lot of our cultures, so they have to look to foreign cultures to find themselves. So a lot of Brazilian country folk don't see themselves represented by the state approved ideology, so they have to look at America, which is the competing ideology, in the sense that they provide a culture that dialogues with their own culture.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I think you figured it out. And but at the same time, the problem with this is that we're always looking for reference elsewhere. It adds up to the problem of we never having that we end up not having something that are particular to us, right? And Brazil ends up in this identity crisis that we're progressively losing uh, what is our particular features, to the point that even when we try to recover them, we do this in a not so ideal way. We do this in a weird way, right? Uh, that's a hard subject to talk about, honestly.
The end of Brazilian history.
Yeah, when we become South American Indians, that's an actual thing that happens, right? I was just reminded this when there were some people complaining about some initial influx of Indians to Brazil. And there's always that guy saying, "Oh, you're just complaining about people who are the same as you," because Brazilians are either defined by nothing or by the negation of something. It's super tragic. We're just non-whites. We're just non-Europeans. Whatever else fits Brazil, because that's what defines us. Amazing.
That kind of hits home to me because that's how I define myself in many ways, but that's, Brasilia effect.
You ruthless cosmopolitan.
Exactly. Maybe that's why I like America so much.
I was gonna talk about this earlier. I just remembered that consistently Europeans are the most open to other culture kind of cultural group. No, Europeans are much more open to other cultures than other cultures are to Europeans, and you have kind of seen that play out, especially with the Anglo tradition, with their kind of liberalism and trying to help the whole world, or not necessarily help, but trying to convince or force the whole world to adopt their framework to be a more interconnected and dialogue open society, or whatever.
Marketplace of ideas.
Yeah, whatever you want to call it. But you also saw that to a different with a different twist with the Iberians and their more openness to racial relations in a much more intimate way, you could say. The Anglos and the Dutch were very segregationist when they came to uh, direct race relations, while being much more open to cultural exchange and technological and political exchange. On the other hand, the Iberians were very chauvinistic and militaristic and conquestalistic, but on the other hand, they were very open about accepting some cultures, not in the sense that it was, as Beppe has said sometimes, of this great orgy, but much more in the sense that we didn't have this strict enforcement of separate peoples, but we still had this kind of hierarchy and this kind of center periphery relations between our subjects. But I just wanted to point out that this idea of the European mind being much more open than the other minds kind of works against it sometimes, and has worked against the Anglos, and I think has worked against Iberians as well, because this kind of cultural hierarchy that that was prevalent in colonial society eventually faded out in favor of this cultural harmonization. It's a hard word to say.
Yeah, that's true. A lot of hard words today for me as well. Uh, I want to mention something. I'm not really a fan of Aaron McIntyre, if you know the guy. He seems a bit iffy to me, but at some points he has good insights. And he was saying something that I really I really agree to, that individualist societies, they when they are separated from collectivist societies, they tend to be more prosperous. They surpass the collectivist societies. But when they allow the collectivist societies to enter them, they ended up losing the internal battle. So if you could isolate England from, I don't know, from the Ottoman Empire, England will always win because they have this more, they have this greater cultural force, this greater inventive force that allows them to surpass the more collectivist Eastern empires and so on. But when you allow people from Syria, from the Levant, from Turkey, and everywhere else to go to England, those people, those pockets of collectivist peoples inside of England end up destroying that individualist society because you have some asymmetric uh, social warfare, let's say. So, to some extent, even individualist people should be aware of uh, their their group. They should value the group they live in. because if they don't do that, they end up being too vulnerable to people who are working together to some.
The biggest black pill on this is actually slavery, in the sense that before Europeans practiced slavery, they were the wealthiest continent in the world, a fact that is lost to most history teachers, probably, because there's the mainstream view is that Europeans got rich by exploiting other continents and etc. What actually happened is that Europe was the most prosperous, the most adventurous, and the most advanced culture in the world before colonization. But as soon as they started interacting with foreign cultures, especially Portugal, because it had contact with the Moorish world, the Muslim world, and eventually the African and the Indian world, is that what happened is that slavery happened, and slavery, and that's the black pill, was much more uh, nocive or bad or worst to the colonizer than the colonized, because you know slavery was a prevalent institution in the Muslim and the African world. They were used to it. They were used to large slaveholders amassing wealth for themselves while the whole population starved or had a short lifespan. But Europe was not used to that. When Europe became accustomed to the practice of slavery, and especially Portugal, it kind of betrayed their own culture. It kind of began a sort of rot that you see in Brazilian culture up to this day. That being this kind of landholder class, this one with the big plantations of workers with not a lot of care for them, kind of degraded them from this heroic adventurous imperialism to this kind of settled class of just leisure workers and stuff. So that's one of the one of the hardest pills I've ever swallowed. That slavery did much more harm to the character of the Portuguese and the Europeans in general than they did to the enslaved peoples, which were in large parts introduced into a much more advanced and superior uh, uh, civilization before eventually turning on it.
Yeah, most teachers completely ignore, even they don't even know about the great divergence topic, right? How Europe got more developed than the rest of the world before the great discoveries. Because guess what? Discovering the world is a pretty costly affair. You need to have resources for that before taking the profits. So, and this is completely ignored. And that's true. That's even an economic argument against slavery. You can see the same thing in the Roman Empire. Institutionally speaking, the Roman Empire had all the the setup, had all the conditions for an industrial revolution, but they never did that because they had slaves. They didn't need to look for more efficiency. Slavery is more it's more convenient in the short term, but in the long term it leads to stagnation. If you can always throw more people in production and not care about expenses, not care too much about expenses and salaries and so on, why are you going to look for more efficiency? Europe during the Middle Ages, without slavery, were starting to develop better instruments for agriculture. We're starting to leverage more water power with the water mills, and some places the windmills and so on. And now that wealth of knowledge, all the technical development has been reduced with the practice of slavery. And in that process, maybe that's one of the reasons that England and the Low Countries ended up surpassing the Iberian countries, right? Because of the level of forced labor that they used and how they needed to cope with this.
To be fair, or to be more fair to the Iberians, they were much more badass conquerors than the sort of Anglo types could ever imagine. You know, the Spanish conquered the biggest empire in the America with like 100 guys or something like that, and Portugal, for its size, pushed largely above its weight by invading China, India, the whole of Africa, the whole of South America. So they were badass conquerors. That there's no denying that. And the Portuguese civilization and Iberian civilization, uh, I think Beppe would probably talk a little better about this theme, but somewhat follows this kind of Roman erratic way of being in some of these cycles of rapid, aggressive, and militaristic expansion. And after that's over, it falls into a period of stagnation and managed decline. So Portugal had like the great Indian Ocean cycle, where it went around bossing all the peoples of the Indian Oceans into submissions. You had the great Vasco da Gama voyages, the inspiration for the Lusiads. And that was a pretty heroic cycles, and one of the most important and memorable feats of history. And then afterwards, they settled into India and kind of became decadent. They just became sort of middle managers and like boat travelers, and not that much happened that time. In Brazil, the same happened, and you can see that with the bandeirantes, where they, sort of like Portugal, they went to the interior, sacking villages of natives and getting slaves, money, and gold and etc. But eventually, they settled down into this kind of permanent class, and they stopped having this kind of vitality that let them, have this great culture, and they just stagnated into oligarchies.
I don't think you need to go as far back as the Roman Empire. The Spain and Portugal were riding the high tide of the Reconquista during those first discoveries, right? Those Spanish conquerors, conquistadores, and Portuguese explorers like Cortés, Cabeça de Vaca, Pizarro, and so on. They were basically 1 or 2 generations after the conquest of Granada. So I think they still have that ethos, that those genetic balls of steel to go to the end of the world to uh, do their sacred mission, right? We cannot forget that finding the Indies uh, had not only commercial motivations but also the motivation of finding a new path to the Holy Land, right? There's also that Spanish plan to conquer China just in order to defeat the Ottomans.
We
So,
can't also forget Prester John.
that's true. That's true. Portugal was helped the kingdoms of Ethiopia a lot in their fight against the Muslim powers because they have this idea of the Prester John being from that place, right? Yeah, but is that the thing? I know it's a meme, but uh, strong man creates good times creates weak men. It's a cycle. You can see this also in the. I'm a big Bizaboo. You can see this in the history of the Byzantine Empire of if of the Eastern Roman Empire. If you're too triggered by the B word, uh, they had this process of reverting the Muslim conquests and which created great generals and great troops and a well-oiled military machine. But when the things started getting more comfortable, you had this whole century of people just screwing everything up. It's a pretty sad affair.
Well, it's a meme for a reason, because there is inherent truth in it. And I think the meme is true for all there is worth. But speaking of it, I think we're entering hard times indeed. We're just gotta hold out to see if the strong men are going to come up or not, or if we're going to live to see it.
I think so as well. Let's see if Spangler will be vindicated one more time.
The idea of Brazilian identity is something very difficult, as you mentioned, and it branches out for many different topics. But I think that um, my view of it is something that I stressed a lot in this episode, is that Brazilian identity is like a grail that people have to actually look for nowadays instead of merely live in it. It's very hard to find this grail in the sea of, you know, generic, um, generic bullshit that is going on. It's because of the leveling process that I mentioned, right? The Kierkegaardian thing of the, homogenizing everything and everyone wanting to be part of the masses too. That's another thing, which makes Brazil a great playground for progressivism, right? So yeah, that's my view of the issue. There are different identities that a Brazilian can find at the end of the day, but I don't see anyone even trying to look for it. It's it's I mean, it's a very individual, very personal journey, I think, but there's not much of a talk about it. It's all very generic.
Let me just intervene a bit. Hermit had mentioned something that gave me an insight, saying how the Iberian powers had this tendency of being more tolerant in the physical level, so to speak, and also maritime powers like England and the Dutch being more open on a ideological level, and how you can say that Brazil took both of those things to the point that we have no gatekeeping both on the genetic sphere and the ideological sphere, to the point we are this perfect laboratory for any kind of progressivism, because you can try anything and nobody will say, oh, that's not allowed here.
Absolutely. And I think, as Hermit said, I think Brazil, at the end of the day, is the final product of people from other countries should look at Brazil and think, we might go in that direction if we don't do anything, right?
Yeah, see it's a warning, not as a blueprint, please.
Obviously, you don't want to become Brazil, right? Bad ending. The whole world has become Brazil. You don't want the bad ending.
True.
Oh, and since we're in the ending of the episode, I want to thank Mr. Donald J. Trump and all the Americans who elected this man. um, after invading Venezuela, he instantly became one of my favorite presidents, American presidents, that is. The big happening that is going on here in South America makes me a little more, maybe hopeful. I don't know. Even if at the end of the day, this isn't as meaningful to the Brazilian scenario, it's just at the very least interesting to see.
Well, what I'm going to say is that we have basically become, as you guys talked about, this big sponge. We Brazilians have become this big sponge of the world. We absorbed all of the sort of ethnics you can imagine. We absorb all the sort of ideologies you can imagine. And we absorb every kind of technology, culture, everything without a filter. And what happens is that any resort of resemblance of identity that one could ever find anywhere in the world has been lost here. This is the place where all cultures come to die. So when the world is inevitably going to become Brazil, all cultures of the world are going to die, and you all are going to be just mindless, gray goo consumers. And there's the dark picture on the horizon. But that's not the inevitable final result, of course, because history has not ended yet, as some would like you to think. Uh, the the great thing about the Brazilification of the world is that Brazil by itself is not going to stay the same forever, and I don't think that this current kind of establishment of things are going to hold out for much longer. I see a true break from it, especially coming the next few generations, which are probably going to hold a lot of resentment towards a people and a country which denied them any sort of belonging, which sold them this sort of artificial lie about who they are and denied them their past. This whole process of trying to create a one Brazilian identity, or of trying to undermine our natural hierarchies of culture and history, have basically robbed us of our history, of our nation, and all of the things that made this country great, but now have made it just the dumpster of the world, and and an open dumpster at that, because we have our stink lines have seemed to be reaching the point of, overflowing the whole world with this nastiness. And I think the horizon is green, but not that dark yet.
Very well said. Yeah, on my part, I'm not so young anymore, but I hope to live enough to see this developing in a, and also help contribute to direct this in a positive way, because there are also potential to resentment always has this negative potential as well. But I hope we were able to shift this in a positive direction, and people are able to recover some kind of actual identity in order to situate themselves in the world. So okay, that's it. I hope you guys are. I want to thank again Emerald and Hermit for contributing to this episode. Obviously, always very useful insights. And I want to thank everybody who has listened to us one more time. So
Just one thing.
okay,
You guys should remember that our enemies are not all powerful. They are, as I read somewhere, they are closer to snakes than they are to gods. So I don't know. Maybe it's just the invasion that I mentioned, the Venezuelan invasion. But I don't know. Sometimes our enemies are captured in 2 hours. You never know where history is going to, get you with a surprise or something. So I don't know if I have a positive outlook for the future, but I would be a little careful before going all black pill.
no, we should never black pill entirely, but there are risks we need to be aware of, because that's not just a ruling class thing. There's some things are too ingrained in the population.
Oh, absolutely.
I follow Byung-Chul Han's rule of hopeful pessimism. Pessimism because things look bad and they look to keep getting worse, but hopeful because there is still room for it getting better. So there is room for providence, for human action, and for whatever sort of interventions that is. So hopeful pessimism is my motto.
Amen.
Hey, man.
Yeah, just gonna wrap it up and say thanks to you, Emerald, and to you, Beppe, for inviting me again, and for you guys who are listening.
Sure.
Oh, yeah, of course. Thank you, man. I'm a little. I must admit, I'm a little sleepy right now, so I may have rambled a little at the end. But of course, I'm very grateful for the opportunity, as always.
Honestly, we all need to sleep now. But thanks, guys, once again, and thanks to the audience for listening to us. And until next time.